that was interpreted to mean if you're not a Catholic, you're doomed. Certainly don't jeopardize your marriage. Your culpability is minimal because it's really your wife's decision. And you made those vows to each other. You should pursue an annulment. Sin always affects progeny, I mean, there's just no question about it. And in this particular case, you really did have a positive expectation of, interior awareness of God that was much more clear.
So let's see, first up, Dear Father Spitzer, after having 2 children, my wife started using birth control. What is my culpability in this situation? Mike.
Well, Mike, the first thing is certainly don't jeopardize your marriage in this regard. And your culpability is minimal because it's really your wife's decision. But the main thing to recognize is just keep seeing if you might be able to get a word in edgewise, maybe talk a little bit about, NFP rather than ABC, artificial birth control. So just take a look at those statistics on, intimacy in marriage. But that's what you can do right now. And honestly, there's not a lot you're culpable for. Or, you certainly can't force her to do anything, lest you break your marriage apart, and that you do not want to do. Be very careful about that. But see if you can't get her to move over to the side of NFP.
Dear Father Spitzer, my uncle recently passed away. He wanted no fuss over his death, so his children are just having a celebration of life gathering. I feel devastated that he won't be able to have a funeral mass. Is there something wrong with this? Laura.
Well, Laura, I mean, I don't think he's committing a sin, or that the children are committing a sin in trying to, at least, respect his wishes, I guess you'd call it. I think it's crazy not to take advantage of, being, having that final part of, God blessing a person's going, and so I just don't understand why you would not want, maybe he doesn't want a lot of people speaking at his funeral, or a lot of, dissertations, and things of that nature. Maybe he doesn't want a fancy funeral, but not to have a funeral and not to just have that final dimension of your life here on earth, that it is being transformed into the life beyond, and in the context of the Holy Eucharist, and in the context of just remembering the resurrection for which we live, in the context of helping people to separate from you, right? A funeral is also extremely important, a memorial mass, just to remember the person, to help separation, especially when you're dealing with a spouse or children, and maybe they don't think they need to hand him over to God, but we all need to hand people we love over to God, at the time of death. So I don't get it. I don't know why they would want to do it. Of course, it's not mortally sinful not to have a funeral, but it's, I think I absolutely do not understand it. It's like a great blessing from God in the context of the Eucharist. It's there to, literally to all of us to hand over
That's a great image,
the deceased
too.
that we love to God.
I don't know if I ever thought about it that way, but that's really a great image you just mentioned. Okay, very good. Next up, Dear Father Spitzer, my wife and I have 3 adult children. The youngest is now 29 years old and moved back in with us after college. He has held various odd jobs, but is mostly unemployed, depending on us for support. How much am I obligated to provide support for an adult child? Dave.
Well, you're certainly not obligated to provide support for an adult child. There's no moral obligation there. I mean, especially 29 years old, in a college graduate, in good health. I mean, the last thing you want to do is create a ne'er-do-well, right? A person who just Yeah,
I haven't
you
heard
know,
that in a while. Ne'er do well.
oh
Okay.
yeah, I know, but this is basically just
Yeah.
means a guy who's going nowhere, doing nothing. All roads
Right.
lead
Right.
there because
Right.
there's no direction.
Right.
I mean, and if you get into that mode, it's almost kind of a, talk about a form of not just laziness, but almost a acedia. Is
Right.
like a sloth that's very very it affects the spirit
Mm-hmm.
too. I mean, the work is good for a person, creativity is good for a person. Obviously, and having sufficient creativity and work to start a relationship with somebody and bring a family into the world. I mean, 29-year-olds who are perfectly capable with college degrees and things of that
Mm-hmm.
nature, who are basically living at home, taking an odd job of basically, living off the fat of the land.
Mm-hmm.
I would say I am feeling like you. I would really say time to nudge things forward.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I give him a nice amount of time
Mm-hmm.
to get his act together. You got 2 months, 3 months, whatever you feel is good. But eventually, for the sake of that child, you got
Right.
to help him move on so he can do something independently and be responsible for his own livelihood and
Mm-hmm.
hopefully to be a productive enough citizen to be responsible for the livelihood of a family.
Right.
So I don't think it's healthy to
Right.
do that.
But and you would think the
Mhm.
longer it goes on, what happens is the more the person gets used to that lifestyle, the underlying depression that's there, and then they start to doubt their own ability anyway, so it becomes a fear factor of
Yeah.
even going and getting a job.
Oh yeah, and not only the fear factor is basically they're so used to sleeping till 10:30 and so forth and so on, and kind of getting up and having some breakfast
Hmm.
and maybe taking a few rounds at the gym, flip on the television, do some gaming for a few hours. Come on,
Hmm.
it's just like it's acedia, isn't it?
Hmm.
It's really slow to the highest degree, and if you encourage it, it's going to
Right.
be so hard to break that habit because right now he's forming a habit, and if he's 29, he's been
Hmm.
forming this habit since he was 23, so or 22. So
Hmm.
you've got to think about that as 6 years is really up there, and I do think at some point people have to be responsible for themselves. And my parents certainly expected it of all of us, and it was good that they did.
If two non-Catholics are married by a justice of the peace, does the church consider that a valid marriage? Jimmy.
Well, if the intention, okay, first of all, it's the form is going to of the marriage is clearly not valid. However, the marriage itself could well be still a marriage in the true sacramental sense, because if you intended to marry this person, in other words, to commit yourself to that person permanently and exclusively for the rest of your life,
Mm.
for the sake of a family and so forth. If you did that, and you made those vows to each other, you should pursue an annulment. Now, sometimes an annulment is going to be easier to get if you have what's called a violation of form.
Hmm.
In other words, you did it in front of a just the peace instead of a priest, and so that might produce. It might show that your view of commitment before God was certainly lacking. It might also show that the nature of the commitment itself was not particularly
Hmm.
valid, and so at that point it might a tribunal could easily just grant an annulment for a violation of form, or could grant an annulment
Hmm.
because, of course, the violation of form implies that a valid marriage contract was never commissioned in the first place, that there was no intention of permanence or exclusivity, or there was no intention of bringing this marriage about before God with as it were, the
Right.
sacramental vow before
Right.
God.
Dear Father Spitzer, in a recent episode you described the Trinity. Is there a hierarchy among the three consciousnesses that in effect make up God with the Father at the top? Thank you very much, Don.
Well, Don, yeah, that's a really astute question, and I can tell maybe you got a metaphysical background because you surely articulated my position very well.
Hmm.
But the main thing is you don't want to give an ontological hierarchy to the Trinity, as you probably know, an ontological hierarchy is a hierarchy in being that the Father either has more power or something than the Son or something of that nature. So you got to be very careful about the notion of hierarchy in that sense. What we say instead is there is an order of procession. So remember when I was talking about those three self-consciousnesses, I said, well, what are they doing? Well, they're in relationship with each other in love, right? So the Father then is the initiator of the love relationship. He is, as it were, the lover. The Son, calls him, and Jesus calls himself Ha agapetos, right? Doad, the beloved one, right? And then the Holy Spirit is the beloved of the Father and the Son, the beloved of the lover and the beloved. And so, what you might just say is the Father is the first in the order of procession of love. And there's a natural ordering of procession of love, and the Father is first as lover, the Son is second as beloved, the Holy Spirit is third as the beloved of the lover and the beloved. So, in that order of procession, yes, but it's not like a temporal order. Like the Father did his thing first, and then the Son did, because they're all transtemporal.
Hmm.
Remember that the three self consciousnesses that are making an unrestricted use of the one unrestricted and unconditional power,
Hmm.
those three self consciousnesses are basically, intrinsic to the one infinite power. So there is no ontological order, and they're all transtemporal. I mean, in as much as an unrestricted power has to be transtemporal, otherwise it would certainly, be restricted in the manifestation of that
Hmm.
power. So an unrestricted power is by definition a transtemporal power. It's outside of time. It's beyond time, as Augustine would call it, the eternal now.
Hmm.
Now, all three of those persons are in the eternal now. So you don't want to say that the order of procession is a temporalized ordering of procession.
Hmm.
So I'm hoping you get this because essentially it's an order of procession that is, someone is going to be the lover, up front, and somebody's going to be the beloved as their core identity up front, and someone's going to be the beloved of the unity.
Hmm.
And it just so happens that obviously from a processing point of view, it's one, two, three, but the procession is not in time.
Dear Father Spitzer, did the Catholic Church ever teach that only Catholics are saved? And if so, what changed, how, and why? Brian.
Well, Brian, the wording basically is that the church is a necessary means for salvation, and so when you look at that, you say, well, wait a minute. Then if you're outside the Catholic Church, then you're not receiving the graces of the church. The Second Vatican Council in Lumen Gentium 16 actually clarified this
Hmm.
and said, look, when you say that the church is necessary for salvation, what you're talking about is the graces of Jesus that were won through his passion and death. That's the graces that the church brings to us through the Holy Spirit. In Lumen Gentium 16, the church says, look, these graces are not denied to you. You can't be denied to you by God's own justice because of an accident of birth. So you were born in India and you didn't hear about it, or you didn't, you wouldn't have practiced Catholicism because you'd been ostracized or whatever. I
Hmm.
mean, whatever the fact is the church is saying is you can't be condemned. God would never condemn you because of the situation that you got born into, and you were not, essentially, you
Hmm.
didn't hear of the Catholic Church. You didn't have a chance to reject the Catholic Church. A lot of people interpret, John's Gospel to mean that,
Hmm.
but the Catholic Church has never interpreted John's Gospel to mean that. It just means an intentional rejection of Christ is, of course, could jeopardize your salvation. But an intentional rejection of Christ would require knowing Christ, knowing, what Christ has done for us in the order of salvation, and intentionally rejecting him because of a disfavor, disagreement with, his approach to love, his approach to morality, or whatever the case may be. Now, but aside from that, the church does not mean somebody who's a Hindu or a Jewish person is going to be condemned. And in fact, the wording that the church uses, and I'm paraphrasing this, I don't have it memorized perfectly, but those who are trying to follow God and trying to do this by the dictates of their own conscience. So, in other words, they form their own conscience, and they, what is right, and they're trying to follow the Lord according to the dictates of their conscience. These too are saved by the merits of Jesus Christ, namely the gifts that the church has to give. And so these two can be saved, by the merits of Christ. And of course, that means that they're trying to live a just life and so forth. But that's basically the doctrine. So, the Catholic, the Second Vatican Council actually gives definition to that and clarification to that. For a long time, the idea of the church being essential for salvation was interpreted by many people to mean outside the phrasing was, outside the church there is no salvation. But that was interpreted to mean if you're not a Catholic, you're doomed. But as Vatican II clearly says, there's just no way you can interpret any of Jesus's words to mean that a person can be condemned because of an accident of birth or because they didn't know about Jesus or something of that nature. That's a patent absurdity. So you have to balance the two things.
Dear Father Spitzer, if Adam and Eve never sinned, would it have been possible for any of their descendants to have sinned? If their great-grandchild had been the first to sin, would that have been passed on to all people like the original sin? Liz.
Sin always affects progeny, there's just no question about it. And in this particular case, and you really did have, I think, a positive expectation of, a real, interior awareness of God that was much more clear. We're not, Adam and Eve did not see through a glass darkly. They had a view of God through their soul, which was not clouded, by obviously egocentricity at the maximum. And so somehow, even with that very clear vision of God, there was some moment of rebellion. Whatever, it's not necessarily, it's a metaphor to have the tree in the middle of the Garden of Eden, right? So, essentially, but the tree represents something, and it represents, I want everything God has, and I'm not satisfied with just what I got. You're withholding something from me, and I want it, and I'm going to rebel until I get it. So there is some moment of rebellion. There's some moment of egocentricity, self-idolatry, or even the envy of God, right? And so the idea behind the biblical passage is, when you do that, you are definitely going to affect not just yourselves, but you're going to affect your children as well. And God obviously says the blinding that comes from sin, it shall be everyone's. And so, and of course, Jesus Christ comes along and redeems us, through baptism. Obviously, we believe that we're completely, redeemed from that. But concupiscence, that's not taken away from us. That part is still there, bothering us fully. But of course, we have the grace of Jesus Christ to save us in the midst of the rebellion.